Hello, everybody. I'm Dr. Anderson. I'm a psychologist here at Anna Shaw Children's Institute. I will be the tiny person at the top of your screen walking you through this topic. Before we get started, just a quick disclaimer that you can see here. You can pause and read through it, but I'm going to keep going. So when we are thinking about our children's diagnoses, one of the things that we do need to think about is how they um, can and will share those diagnoses with other people, specifically their friends and peers and people that they interact with on a daily basis. So this is a question that comes up frequently, and I've noticed that a lot of times parents want to kind of rush to what I feel like is actually the end of the conversation, which is how should my child, how can we prepare my child to talk about this? What should they say? But I think the first step is to actually ask, should my child be talking about their diagnosis with friends? So there are some considerations. Before I get going too deeply, I think the answer to that question is usually yes, but it's still important to ask that. So do they have the skills and awareness necessary to improve a situation by talking about their diagnosis? So one, we have to kind of consider that when we're talking about kids, that they'll kind of glean about 10% of what we're actually telling them, and they might not be able to talk about the diagnosis in such a way that would actually be helpful to their friends or to the peers, or be helpful in clarifying the situation in any way. So, do they have the skills and awareness necessary to talk about their diagnosis effectively? Two, will it benefit your child to talk about it? As in, is their diagnosis heavily impacting their everyday life? If it's not, then maybe this is not something that they should be talking about on the regular. As Dr. Brandt pointed out in previous presentations surrounding this topic, this really is just a part of who your child is, and that's really what we want to focus on that as being. It's just a small part of who they are. And then third, should you help your child with a broad, more encompassing explanation of the diagnosis, or is a more targeted approach better? So this is if you've decided, yes, we want them to talk about their diagnosis, um, to figure out how you're going to do that. So my little note at the bottom, just even if you decide that you don't exactly want to train your child in talking about their diagnosis, or introducing their diagnosis to somebody, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't train your child to be prepared to talk about it, because it might come up. So I think a good and simple way to look at this is, what is the goal? What is your goal for sharing a diagnosis, or what is the child's goal sharing a diagnosis? So for your child, there- as far as their understanding of a diagnosis, they should try to understand as much as possible about their diagnosis. It is going to impact their life every day, because they are the ones that are managing their social life. They're the ones that are managing their home life, and they're the ones that are managing their health. So it really is important that they have not only an understanding, but kind of a deeper understanding of their diagnosis, and more of the details on what it means to have that diagnosis and where it comes from and how to manage it. Um, and I think sometimes it's easy to just kind of assume that that's what everybody else needs to know too. And that's just simply not true. So when we're talking to other children about it, they really just need to understand the highlights and or kind of the specific instructions that might be needed to help your child and them thrive in a social relationship. So we really don't want to overshare, and we don't want to overburden them with information, because too much information, especially for a child or especially for even an adult that's just kind of more casually in their life, can make it sound like your child is unmanageable because of all of these many quirks that they have, when in reality, that's just not often the case. So we want to present this information in a controlled and focused fashion. So again, before we even discuss the what, we really need to discuss the when, because I don't want to go as far as to say that when is more important than the what, but it is at the at the very least as important as what to share. So you can focus on these three areas with your child, and teach them when they can share, maybe when they should share. So the first one is when something specific comes up. Um, and I've given some examples. So a child asks, "Why do you twitch like that?" Maybe it's an autistic stim, maybe it's a tick. Maybe a child gets upset with your child who has ADHD for interrupting them all the time. That might be a specific reason to talk about a small part of the diagnosis. Um, the second one is when the subject is brought up or it's relevant. So maybe the diagnosis is brought up in science class, and maybe your child has something they'd like to share to contribute to the conversation. Maybe one of their friends, reveals that somebody in their family recently had a diagnosis given to them. And your child wants to then talk about their experience with the diagnosis. That would be appropriate. Then last, when you feel there's potential to recruit an ally, or just kind of when you need help with something specific. So if a child is feeling overwhelmed and they need to ask for help, if a child forgot to take some medication and they want to give a friend a heads up about how their behavior might be changing, or that they have to leave and go take that. I don't think there's any need to be cryptic about your diagnosis and necessarily hide it, but just waiting for it to come up more organically and waiting for it to be relevant, I think goes a long way in helping other children to not only understand the diagnosis, but also to be comfortable around the diagnosis. And I think that is ultimately the primary goal that all parents and children have, is that they want to be accepted, even though there's this part of them that is different than everybody else. And so that works towards our goal if we are careful as to when we share it. So, so just some tips for your child when they're talking about it. Um, you should encourage your child to end with what they can do. So there's a tendency that once a child shares a diagnosis, that, especially with other children, if that's one of the only things they know about them, then they become so and so with autism, so and so with ADHD, that's so and so they have Tourette's, so and so they get anxious, they're scared all the time. So so we don't really want to concentrate on giving kind of an educational dissertation on what the diagnosis is and how it manifests necessarily, or why it manifests or why it's there, but more how it impacts your everyday life, what it might look like when it pops up, and um, you know, what you can do. So if you're nervous around large groups of people, you don't want to just say, "Hey, I have social anxiety. I don't like groups, big groups." Well, now that's all anybody's ever going to think about when you're around. But if you say, "Hey, I get a little bit nervous around big groups. I'm pretty cool though around groups, three or less, or if we're all doing a quiet activity together, so then kids know, okay, oh, so and so gets nervous around groups, but they could be included in stuff like this." Um, it helps them to see your child as somebody that is still kind of on the market for doing normal things, typical things that kids do. Maybe not all of the typical things, but some of them, most of them. Um, the second is practice what will be said at home. Everyone overestimates their ability to share information that's in their head out loud. It just sounds so good in our head, and we feel like we know all about it. But as soon as we try to put words to it, when there's a little bit of an audience, it is so easy to stumble and to get confused and say things, in reverse order, or in a mixed up order, and you just find yourself kind of trying to re-explain things, and it just kind of turns into a mess. And kids have a short attention span, and so they're really ready to move on. And so it's really good to practice some common scenarios, which brings me to the third one, which is focus on what is likely to come up. Instead of focusing on all of these possible situations that might happen, or focusing on how to explain what autism is to somebody or what ADHD is to something, it's more important to focus on, okay, in my child's life, in the context of their school, their classroom, their extracurricular groups, what scenarios are likely to come up? And focus on those. Focus on specific areas that are likely to come up so that you can practice them in a more focused fashion. Um, and then teach your kid to ask themselves if they need to address information about their diagnosis now, like in the moment of that conversation, or if it would be better to wait until later. This is something that I feel like a lot of people take off the table before it's even on it, which is maybe I can just talk about this later. When maybe, I don't know, maybe some kids are talking about a specific type of diagnosis, and your child has a lot of information about it, but maybe it would be better just to say, hey, everybody, I actually have this diagnosis. If you're curious about it, I can say more. Or if somebody, maybe if there's somebody with autism and they're in a group and somebody's shirt is a color that's just offensive to them, we might want to train them with the skill that, hey, it's not polite to call somebody out right there in the moment, but maybe politely pull them aside at the end of the conversation and say, hey, I can't stand too close to you because the shirt color is bothering me, but it's nothing personal. Something that's kind of a silly example, but just some conversations are better to have later rather than in the moment. So I wanted to provide examples before I signed off, because I think a lot can be learned from examples. So a scenario, a child with ADHD gets called out for being too wild. This is a common scenario that we see. Child can talk about their diagnosis like this. Sorry, sometimes it's hard for me to control my behaviors when I get excited. I take medicine to help, but sometimes I have too much fun. Thanks for letting me know. So you'll notice that ADHD was actually not mentioned in that statement. I think if an adult heard that, they'd probably think, oh, okay, maybe that's ADHD, maybe it's not. But ultimately, the children knew what they needed to know about your child, which is they can lose control of their behavior. And that there's medication involved, so it's an actual medical condition, but not too much information was given. And you'll notice that we put the thank you at the end, that it's up to your child to ultimately model that it's okay for others to notice their diagnosis or their disability, and to help them to manage it in appropriate ways. So a child with Tourette's is meeting a first-time friend for a play date. They might say, you might see my eye twitch, or I might say a random word. It does not hurt or anything. It is just something my brain does called tics. You can ignore them when they happen. So you'll notice that in this scenario, they kind of wanted to give a heads up. This was a situation where it was appropriate to give a heads up instead of, trying to hide it and see if they notice. Just get ahead of it. Give a very basic explanation and instructions for how the child can better, accommodate that diagnosis. Just some other points that you might want to add. I don't mind answering questions about it, but it's not something I like to joke about. You can also say something like that at the end. If your child just really doesn't like it, but some children are okay with it. They could say it's okay to laugh at them. Sometimes they can be pretty silly. So again, your child is being an advocate for themselves. They are incorporating their diagnosis into who they are, but it is not defining who they are. You'll notice that both of these statements are are giving information, but then they're moving on to play, kind of like moving it towards moving back to play and just kind of hanging out with one another. Okay, so another scenario, child notice that a child with, or I would say today, children notice that a child with autism is playing alone despite being invited to join the group. A response might be, "Thank you for inviting me. Sometimes it's hard for me to play in groups because of my autism, but I'm happy playing next to you." So again, we're not going into a big treatise about autism and what it is. It's fine, we label it. We're being polite. We're kind of reassuring the group. And to me, that polite statement kind of opens it up for questions. Another example might be, "I have autism and sometimes it is easy for me to get overwhelmed. If we can turn down the sound down, I might be able to play. If not, I understand." So in this scenario, maybe they're playing a video game or something. Yes, again, we're labeling the autism, but we're also focusing on how the group can make it work. We're focusing again on what we can do. So that statement basically says, yeah, I can do this, but the volume might have to be turned down a little bit. So we're giving ourselves a way forward. A child with anxiety is worried about something, whatever it is they're anxious about. "Hey everyone, I think I need to take a little break. I'm starting to feel a little overwhelmed. I'll catch up later." So in this instance, we did not label anxiety. We just talked about what we needed. And in this case, a child should certainly be prepared to answer some questions, but again, especially in the context of children, I don't think the label is as important as what that label means. And just telling them what the label means can help them focus on solutions. And it is more likely that those groups of children will look at your child for the typical person that they are, rather than the exceptional diagnosis that they have. So I hope that I think a lot of these things look complex, and they are, which is why I really mentioned practice a lot and focusing in on specific situations, because I think handling these conversations effectively kind of lends itself to shrinking it down a little bit and helping them to focus on things that actually matter. A lot of the examples I gave might be overly eloquent for a child, but I think you'd be surprised that if you have a focused conversation on specific situations, just how cleanly kids can explain things and navigate situations. So ultimately, we are trying to get our children to a point where they are advocating for themselves and their specific needs, and that they are showing kids how they can do things and what they can participate in, and they are asking for specific support when they need it. So, I think I'll close with a final statement, which usually the anxiety surrounding a diagnosis is often it often begins and ends with adult anxiety surrounding their child's diagnosis. The adult doesn't quite know how to handle it, and they get nervous about certain situations, but children, I mean, every situation they're in is new, and they're getting introduced to new things about themselves every month. And so this is not that big of a deal for them. So it's really important to model kind of healthy behavior and a healthy attitude surrounding this diagnosis, so that your children can learn from that. But thank you.